The way I see it is I'm a conductor. I am a conductor with a lot of people who know their instruments way better than I do. So I better listen to them. My job is to create an environment where they can thrive.
Hey everyone, I'm Lucas Mendes, CEO and founder of Revelo. Today we're joined by Ferdinand Hingerl, CTO of Ambyint. Ambyint is dedicated to supporting upstream oil and gas companies through an AI-powered production optimization platform. They focus on expanding capacities across personnel and production while improving safety and sustainability. Ferdinand, welcome to the show. To start, tell us a little bit about your background.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. And Lucas, it's a pleasure to meet you and pleasure to be on the podcast today. So I'll try to keep this one short. So my name is Ferdinand, or short Ferdy. There's a lot of different names people give me here abroad. I think that just happens when you're an immigrant, now Canadian, actually, proud Canadian. But anyway, so I grew up in Germany, went to different institutions there, then ultimately ended up doing my PhD at ETH Zurich in, how can we describe this the best way? It's probably like computational chemistry for geothermal, high pressure, high temperature fluids. And after that, went over to the US, did my postdoc at Stanford. After 3 years in academia, had a lot of fun. It was beautiful, but ultimately, I love writing papers, but not enough to really spend the rest of my day doing it. So I want to do something that really touches people's life, that has impact on either, how humans interact or how we interact with our environment. Energy always has been a big passion of mine, because I just think that ultimately it's the foundation of our society in pretty much every way. So I decided to work for, back then, Stanford's spin-off, and I had 2 locations, one in San Francisco, one up in Canada, in Calgary. And I thought back then, now my wife met her at Stanford, that, hey, why don't we move up to Canada? I love this country. I've been there before quite a few times. We made the move up, worked for this job for 3 years, learned a lot, learn about the difference between academia and industry life, which is completely different. Ultimately, after 3 years, I found Ambyint, and I saw that they have a very interesting value proposition. So the product was exactly what I've been always trying to do from the impact perspective, but also the way how they actually do it from the tech perspective. That sort of just checked all the boxes. And then I started as a data scientist here at Ambyint about 6.5 years ago. Worked my way through the company, now the CTO of Ambyint, and have a fabulous team, and we do some pretty amazing stuff, I think. So,
can you tell us a little bit more about that journey from data scientist to CTO?
Absolutely. So when I started at Ambyint, my first task was to stand up, with the help, obviously, of business development and the commercial team, a new product line. We didn't have anything. I came in, I had, frankly, no idea about that kind of natural gas application. It was a new artificial lift type that we tapped into back then called plunger lift, mainly used for natural gas wells. So I really sort of stumbled over this, and I was back then, CTO told me, try to figure it out. You got the brains for it. I was like, you sure? So essentially really started as a data scientist and learned the way of Ambyint, which was a very powerful way to actually look at problems. With my background, I always used to really look at things from a first principle perspective. How can you really develop away from molecular simulations all the way to sort of like a fluid dynamics relation? How can you products that really are leveraged for things such as production optimization and such? However, realizing that the data quality coming from all these IoT systems that we're working with at Ambyint is very low. And I just realized physics is not going to get us to where we need to be. Right? In the end, we are executing set point optimization. So that's what we do. So we control how natural gas pumps in oil wells. And we need to be able to change within a few percent. Now, if you have data that come in that have very large uncertainty, then, statistically, that's just not possible. So you need different methods. And we started coming up really over the years with this sort of, we call it the secret sauce, which is a trifecta of combining physics and engineering calculations with SME knowledge that we basically hard code, because there's a ton of people out there that have been working with these engineering problems for 20, 30 plus years, and they may not necessarily have insight into what the multi-phase flow phenomena is that actually governs that, but they know exactly what to do in what kind of situation. right?
They're calibrated. You can hard code them there and just use the cards.
It's incredibly impressive, right? I always look at it as Neo from the Matrix. He's looking at code coming flowing down, and just he sees people in there, he sees somebody eating a pizza and all that, right? That's literally how these folks work, right? You show them some multivariate time series data, and they point, whoops, that's where something went off the rails, right? It's very impressive. So we can learn a ton from these people. That was one of the big learnings of mine. And then we started using that on those two different sort of approaches and complemented them with machine learning based pattern recognition, et cetera, and other methodologies. So the trifecta really led us to the next step. And that was sort of a big success back then. And that we also, started replicating in other product lines. And then ultimately, I got the opportunity to work as a team lead. And people have always been extremely important to me. I love working with people, and I think it's a little bit in the family, sort of that the social responsibility of a leader is something that's paramount to me, and how I grew up, it's something that's just ingrained in me. So I really started enjoying that and really benefiting from that, and really wanted to build a great team where people really feel, as the way I do, that we are part of something really great here. We do something very special. And we love working with each other. And that's what drives innovation, right? So ultimately, I think that was successful. And then that's sort of how I then went from the leadership of that section, data science, to the whole tech team, and then ultimately CTO, which obviously is now a different role, much more external facing as well, working with different stakeholders, also as investors, board members, et cetera, right?
It's quite a journey. Amazing. From academic scientist to data scientist to team lead to CTO. Now, as you mentioned, for some time now, your work has been mostly around managing teams. So I'll start off with this question. What do you think separates a great engineering team from one that's just okay?
I think what makes a team really great is, to be honest, it's obviously impact ultimately, but you also see it in their face. We have like a hybrid kind of work environment with some team members, like for instance, Revelo, folks, they work down in South America or Latin America, some here in Calgary, and so on. But when I see people come to work and I see they're passionate, they really enjoy each other's presence and working with each other, then that's sort of really coming back to that people component. Then you create an environment that creates innovation. And if you look at the size of our company, we are at 50, 60 people or so. We are really up against the big ones like the Schlumbergers, Baker Hughes, and so on of this world. Right? They have way more funding, much larger teams, highly focused on innovation, that is highly committed, and that's really passionate about what they do. And I think that's really one of these things where I would say, if you have a team that's truly passionate about what they do, then that is one of the features that distinguishes a great team from a good team. Because you can have really good people working on a problem, but ultimately, if you want to be the best in your field, you need passion, and everything that comes with that really distinguishes you from the others.
That's a great perspective. And you mentioned a little bit about your role being external facing. What do you see as in the relationship between you, the CTO, and engineering leaders like VPs of engineering, directors of engineering? And what does the ideal relationship between those two actors look like in a company?
There's so many different perspectives on this question, and I'm not claiming that mine is the right one. I believe the setup that we're having works pretty well, and it works also really well for the people. So I'm just going to walk you through how I personally see the world. Again, not claiming it's the right way, but the way I see it is I'm a conductor. I'm a conductor with a lot of people who know the instruments way better than I do. So I better listen to them. My job is to create an environment where they can thrive, where they can work together to create a really nice, harmonic environment where they create their symphony. But ultimately, each individual contributor only shines if the entire team works together. They're my eyes on the ground. These are the folks who help me develop the vision. I have an idea of where we want to go that is driven by, a lot more stakeholder interests than they may necessarily be involved in. However, they're the ones who I fully rely on, the technical advice, also their people side, they know, hey, listen, that policy that we pushed out is not really flying really well. So my job is mainly to listen and enable. That's really for me the key there, right?
It's a great way to look at it. Yeah. But things are changing very fast, though. I'm sure that this perspective has evolved over
Oh
time.
yeah,
There's changes happening all at once: AI, remote,
yes.
hybrid, nearshoring, economy. How are you adjusting the way you manage teams?
I think it's COVID. Obviously, the pandemic was a really big one. That's where things changed drastically. So before the pandemic, we were entirely Calgary based. Basically, the entire technology and product that was here in Calgary. Then during the pandemic, we started to really leverage nearshoring as well, because frankly, a lot of the tech companies just were extremely successful. They started building out their teams. We didn't find people anymore. So we really sort of heard of nearshoring systems and companies like Revelo, and really started pulling people in and saw that, man, this is amazing, right? So there's this more old school way to think about, oh, we only hire where our headquarters is or something like that. That didn't make sense anymore, because frankly, you have extremely smart people in, I don't know, in Brazil, in Mexico, in the US, wherever, right? It doesn't really matter. So you want to sort of find a compromise where you can work for me personally, it's important to have people in a very similar time zone. But outside of that, we changed in a way that we were much more open to also, pull people in where they are. Ultimately, talent is where they are. We can't tell talent to exist exclusively in Calgary. That makes no sense, right? So really starting to leverage nearshoring, and also with that, then more like a hybrid work environment and all the benefits that we all, including myself, highly benefit from. That was a big change, because then questions came up with like, how do you maintain and foster team culture when you can't go out for lunch with each other anymore physically, right? These are things that are extremely important to me, right? I really want that everybody who works for us is part of the journey and they identify with that. I'm not talking in a cultish way, but you literally live 6 to 10,000 kilometers away is not an easy task. So I would argue that's probably one of the big changes here. And we constantly have to adjust and really ask yourself, okay, is the way we did this last year really still the way we should do it this year? You have to be super dynamic on these questions, right?
You mentioned culture. How intentional are you in designing or directing what you want the culture of your engineering team to be?
So culture is, for me, the way we work and the way we interact with each other. That is not something that you can prescribe. That is not something that you can, really put on a website and say, this is our culture. That has nothing to do with that, really. Ultimately, you as a team have to define what are your what is the social contract when you work together as a team? What is the cultural net that connects us all? And then with the team, really define those values that you want to live as a team collectively. Ultimately, that also determines that, for instance, even when you start hiring and recruiting new people, really talk about that. Values, ultimately, it doesn't really matter what you say, it matters what you do. So if you don't live the values, so you have to be very open to also, getting feedback from the team around, hey, listen, the way you did this yesterday, I'm not sure that aligns perfectly well.
That's right. You mentioned that you have to onboard people into a culture, onboard people into a team, and the vintages of talent have changed drastically, right? So what are you seeing when it comes to engineering talent today versus, say, 5, 7, 10 years ago?
Academic area, right? So a lot of these degrees didn't exist back then. So naturally, with the introduction of these new degrees, new talent comes on board, and everything changes, right? So the dynamics of a system changes, and you have to adapt to that. Sometimes it's relatively simple, but sometimes it's also not, right? So now you have experts from completely different backgrounds that suddenly come in here, and other people have to get used to that. The way we develop software nowadays in the cloud is so completely different than how we did it like 10, 15 years ago, right? So the team composition and the people with their experience completely changed, but also the tech stack itself completely changed. And obviously it's adapting. It's almost impossible to keep track, right? So it's extremely dynamic, but ultimately I think for us leaders, that is something that we have to embrace and value and be very open to that, and also promote it, that sort of openness and support for that dynamic change. Nothing is static, right? And it's not for everyone, right? But I think ultimately, if you're in a startup or in a scale up like us, if you are not part of that and you don't really support and live that, I would argue it's pretty difficult to stay afloat for a longer time.
Makes a lot of sense. One of these tools, one of these skills that people have to get on with and get acquainted with is obviously AI. How do you see AI impacting the way your team works and the way that you manage them? Is it having an impact already? Is it improving productivity? Is it changing how you think about things?
Yeah, that's a big topic. And I think before I directly answer that, I think we have to distinguishing. This has been a little bit, well, a little more, but I was actually a buzzword, especially 3-4 years, right? So when I started about 8.5 years ago, it started really with AI in mind as a means for pattern recognition and set point optimization. So autonomous process control, right? So Ambient has leveraged AI from the beginning. But I assume what you're talking about is more like the more recent developments on how you could leverage things such as, Gen AI and those tools for the interaction and the way we work. And yes, that has an influence, right? There's constantly this search for how can we leverage these more recent LLM-based technologies for the team. How can, especially on the tech side, obviously they can be extremely helpful, also dangerous, in my opinion. How can we actually leverage this, right? And I think it requires a lot of education. 5 to 10 years ago, the only folks who really had a sort of a contact and really application experience with AI were the data scientists or machine learning engineers, whatever you call them. That has changed now. Now, suddenly these tools are available for a much broader audience, for way more stakeholders than it used to be the case before. So they also look at this from a very different perspective. They don't really necessarily understand the theoretical underpinnings of all these technologies. Neither do they have to do so, right? But now you have to sort of teach them to leverage these different tools, but also teach them what they can trust and what they can't really trust, right? It's with any technology. You can't just pick it up and then believe it's going to solve all your problems. You need to understand what the advantages and the shortcomings are. Let me give you an example. Like Copilot is in everybody's ears nowadays. So one tool that most developers probably use nowadays, and it's a great tool. On the other hand, I also think that I would be very careful giving that tool straight into the hands of a junior developer, because if they simply copy paste what the tool generates, you will create a lot of problems in your code, right? So it's this sort of learning on how to deal with these new technologies you want to increase productivity, but at the same time, code quality and your personal understanding of what you actually, push up to production has to be maintained. You cannot outsource that responsibility. Ultimately, my team or I are accountable for what's in production. It's not ChatGPT. Right. So the team has to fully understand what has been created. So it's like a co-pilot. It advises you, it gives you information for your decision making, but ultimately the responsibility stays with you. So you have to be very smart in the way you actually leverage these new tools. And that needs a lot of discussion and training also for those folks.
And I think I loved your preface actually, because what happened was that the breadth of application went from neural networks, where people were actually developing the neural networks, which did not have any conversational or language-based interaction layer, to something that, feels very natural. And therefore, I think there's an assumption, an illusion of correctness. Like you assume that the output is correct, and you don't have to get into the details of how it works. So, and that illusion is dangerous, right? Because you have to question the outcome. You need to understand it better than the machine.
100%. And that probabilistic nature, not everybody is aware of that. For somebody who works with AI and has been working with AI, that is not even a question. But for folks who come in and then sort of learn everything AI related, essentially from their interaction with ChatGPT, I would be very careful with that, because they're probably missing a lot of the uncertainty that's associated with those responses that they get there. So be careful, because always be very cautious with whatever you do there. However, I definitely encourage folks to leverage these tools. They're amazing. Just know when to use them and sort of the price you may have to pay if you're not careful with them.
I want to shift gears here a
Mhm.
little bit and ask you, what advice would you give to aspiring engineering leaders and CTOs? People who are listening to us right now and want to someday become a VP of engineering, a CTO of a startup or a large company. What advice would you share with them?
Yeah, I think so. If I just look back at my own sort of career steps here, one thing that I didn't learn in academia was really that everything around, frankly, team leadership and how to work in large teams to develop product. And that's the second piece, right? Don't just focus on the technology, focus on product. Ultimately, you develop product that is supported by a tech stack. But frankly, your user probably doesn't care if you use this AI or this algorithm. It's completely irrelevant, right? So really focus on impact of what you do, impact on your customer, impact on ultimately as a CTO, then also your investor board, but then also on your people. I think there's a lot more to these roles than sampling. I have to use this term carefully because obviously it's a very complex area, but the tech stack, right? A lot of folks sort of in technology companies work their way through the ranks by becoming better and better at their technology and the engineering knowledge and all that. And don't get me wrong, that's very important. But ultimately, I think what really distinguishes a good leader is how their team feels when they work with each other, how their productivity is, how their innovation capacity is, and all that. It's really reflected in these much more human-centric components that you ultimately have to provide the ground where everybody else can flourish. I think that is really the main task. And that's a very difficult one. And that's not something you learn in a Coursera course, as much as I love those courses, right? So there's way more to that. So I personally learned a lot from our CEO, who he used to come from sales and recruiting. So people were really at the center of everything he did, the way he leads, the way he thinks about people and all that. So I had to learn a lot there. And I was very eager to learn this because I really felt that if you have a good leader in a position, everybody else, you will see it in everybody's face around you. And you will see it in the impact your product has on your customers, in all these different metrics, right? But really comes back to learn and really try to understand the people around you, try to really understand yourself better, what your own motivations are and all that. There's a lot of soft/power skill, knowledge and experience that you have to gain. That is simply not, as easily tangible as engineering knowledge per se. So that's sort of my advice. Really focus on the people, focus on how people work. Listen a lot to Simon Sinek. He's great.
Start with why. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that the focus on product. I think even when you look at some mid-level budding engineering leaders, there's some antagonism between tech and product. Oh, product wants this, but I want to build it this way. It's actually one serves the other in a sense, right? Because that's the outcome you need.
About 3 years ago, we made the transition from functional groups to squads. And that was a game changer for us. Like until like 4 years ago, I can't remember exactly the timing now, but we had our different tech departments, like you have QA, you have DevOps, you have the front-end developers, et cetera, data science and so on. And then we had product. So basically product decided roadmap and then almost threw it over the fence to the different tech team units, et cetera. And we always had this us against them mentality. And it deeply bothered me because ultimately we formulate this inside our team as well, and in really sort of the structure and the fundament of how we operate with each other. That's how we really transition to squads, where we have a completely interdisciplinary team, product inside, customer success inside, and then obviously every flavor of technologist inside, where we together focus on developing products for our customer. And that was a game changer because suddenly product really realized, hey, the developers are struggling with this right now. So we need to give them a little bit more feedback on this. At the same time, they were now much more empathetic to the development process, could feed that information back to the customer, which then also was more empathetic to potential product delays and all that. We could also be way more focused on really producing what actually had an impact as a product. So we didn't just develop technology anymore. We really developed product. And it sounds so simple, but it's a huge difference. But by really bringing all the stakeholders in the room on a weekly basis and focusing on the one goal together, that really helped us overcome a lot of that. Like siloed, right?
That's a great perspective. And I think that there's a lot of people who love squads, but in and of themselves, they're not valuable. I think the value in squads is being a forcing function for what you're suggesting. The focus on product should be the priority. I want to move us into the last couple of questions here. And I want to throw you a curveball now. What is an opinion that you have as a CTO engineering product leader that you think that sort of goes against the grain of what is considered best practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm talking a lot to other tech leaders, and every single person I talk to has a different approach. So to be honest, I don't even know what the standard practice is at this point, because everybody has a different team. Everybody has a slightly different case or scenario that they're actually trying to solve from a product perspective. So I don't really have an exact answer. I think it's so situationally dependent, but I really haven't encountered one philosophy where everyone would say, that's the way to go. And, if you don't do that, that's not standard practice. So I can't really give you a direct answer there. I think it really depends on how your team works, what your values are, what your customers' interests are, what your board's interests are, and all that. That's really how you dynamically have to adjust to all these things. So not sure I can give you a straight answer to your curveball question here. Sorry.
So I'll add another final question here. What do you say to young people who are thinking about a career in technology, a career in software engineering? There's a lot of noise around AI and LLM-based code generation and how that's going to replace programmers in the short term. How do you see the future of a career as a software engineer?
So software engineering and data science, ultimately, I think we will all leverage these tools more and more, and we will use them as co-pilots. But I strongly believe actually that when it comes to domain knowledge and complex systems understanding, that is not something these tools will be able to take over for quite a while. Even the data science side, if you look at data science, let's say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I'm not sure exactly when scikit-learn came upon, but back then, you really had to hard code a lot of the algorithms actually yourself. Nowadays, you have these libraries that are so darn good that it's actually becoming more simpler and simpler to leverage those. You don't really even have to understand anymore how the individual algorithms work. However, I still believe when it comes to the domain knowledge itself, that is how you can distinguish yourself. There's a little bit more that advice that I give to data scientists, to be honest, where I say that, hey, focus on a domain. Really get deep in the domain. Let it be physics, engineering, chemistry, whatever it is, right? That gives you a very good understanding of how things actually work. And you learn to think in a very methodological way, very logical way. And you learn how to solve problems. Then leverage these tools and get familiar with as many tools as you can to really have that big toolbox with you so that whatever problem is thrown at you, you have a means that you can try to solve that problem. And I think that experience set together with that toolbox and the domain knowledge, that is ultimately the path that you want to prepare yourself for. Don't focus too much on technologies. Right? If you know now SageMaker versus MLflow versus what I don't know, right? That is tools you can learn. Focus on the underpinning of that and really that domain knowledge-specific thinking that will set you apart from the others, in my opinion.
That's a great way to look at it. Ferdinand, you've hired a few engineers to Revelo. I'm curious, sort of what brought you to finding value in nearshoring? So if you could sort of walk me through that thought process and the outcomes, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So As I mentioned earlier about during the pandemic, we started leveraging nearshoring services such as Revelo. And yeah, ever since, haven't really looked back because we have made really positive experiences. So ultimately, the reason back then was a very practical one, a very pragmatic one. Let's be honest, it was really that during the pandemic, the costs that we face as an organization, but where we had to scale our team, but simply couldn't keep up with the salaries that the Microsofts, the Spotifys, et cetera, of the world paid. So we were really we had a problem because we needed people, but all the big organizations swooped up everybody from the market. So we literally didn't have an opportunity. But ultimately, what that led us to is that we tried to explore different options. And that was nearshoring. Obviously, we also looked into options in Eastern Europe and other areas of the world, but the time difference was just not something that we could really work with. That in person, or if you don't have like in-person time, but in time zone time where you can discuss life through certain problems and really work as a team on addressing challenges, is something that we could only find in the nearshoring model. And it comes back to then also to a previous comment that I made. You have to look for the talent where they are and hire them where they are. And there's a ton of very, very strong developers, data scientists, and other technologists in other countries. So don't confine your scope only to your place, but really look for where the people actually also can be. And that's what we did, and that's what we still do. So back then we hired, I can't remember exactly how many, but we currently have, I think, 4 or 5 folks from like nearshored folks from Latin America on the team, and they're an absolutely fundamental part of our team. The team culture and the way they work with each other, the commitment, and frankly also the fun. I love that it's very stereotypical, but the Latin American spirit, I tell you, that's what you want to have on the team, because these people bring a lot of enjoyment and fun to the team, and everybody has been benefited from that. So I see no reason to diverge from that direction.
That's great to hear. Ferdinand, how can our listeners stay in touch with you? LinkedIn, Twitter, how do they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So LinkedIn is probably the best way. I love to connect. I love to chat with people. Always try to learn as much as I can, because as I said, right, there's a million ways to skin this cat, to look at this problem. So yeah, I think it's Ferdinand Hingerl in LinkedIn. It should be pretty easy to find me. My name is a little bit a unique one. So if you look me up on LinkedIn, I'm happy to chat, happy to connect, and yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching Tech Teams today. I'm Lucas Mendes, CEO and founder of Revelo. Today we were joined by Ferdinand Hingerl, CTO at Ambyint. Thank you so much for your time, Ferdinand. I absolutely loved the chat. I personally enjoyed a lot learning more about you, about your journey, and about how you think about engineering teams. Don't forget to like and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Feel free to chime in with your thoughts and comments. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.